And we're about to get started with the first panel. Hope you're following along on the wiki site or on your print schedule. So as you know, we have 6 people reporting on global health. Diana Reyes from Johns Hopkins, talking about Ukrainian refugees who are now in Turkey. What is the impact on their mental health? Wasay and Laiba Mubashar, who came from Qatar. They go to Northwestern University in Qatar, and they did their reporting, as you will hear, in Pakistan on acid attack survivors. We also have Paola, Koki, and Ndombo from GW School of Public Health, and her project is on cervical cancer, prevention in Cameroon. Hart from Georgetown, reporting on why the anti-female genital cutting movement in Guinea failed. And Dylan Ortiz from Westchester Community College, his project is the food insecurity crisis consuming New Orleans. And some of you may have seen a preview of his video. It is linked in the wiki site, so if you are inspired to watch the whole thing and haven't already, you have that opportunity. So I will now turn this over to Diana.
Thank you. Thank you all. Happy to break the ice on behalf of all of you. Hopefully I set a good precedent with time, so, yep. A little close, is that better? Okay. Great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hi, everybody. I'm Diana. I'm talking about Ukrainian refugees and displaced persons in Turkey and the impact of displacement on their mental health. A little bit about me. I'm based in Washington, D.C., live like 20 minutes away from here. I'm first-generation Syrian American, and I'm a PhD student at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Of course, as an academic, I have to lay it thick with my research interests. I'm interested in global mental health, refugee and migrant health, and health in conflict. And actually, I've spent time in Turkey before. I was there in 2017 for a year working for Hopkins on the Syrian response. You might be wondering why there's a plate of a picture of food. One of my favorite parts of being in Turkey is the food, and this is an amazing Turkish breakfast that I was able to enjoy on a bi-weekly basis, thanks to Pulitzer. I'll start off with some statistics. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. There's been a total of 7 million internally displaced in Ukraine as a result, and 7.6 million Ukrainians have sought refuge across Europe. I chose Turkey as a context of interest because it's the largest host of refugees in the world. It's been so for 7 years. They're host to 4 million refugees, approximately 3.6 million of which are from Syria. And I wanted to highlight that currently the economic situation in Turkey is at an all-time low, and it largely impacted the situation that I was researching and looking at. Inflation's at 84%, a 24-year high, leading to many political tensions and pushback against immigration broadly. The numbers of Ukrainians in Turkey are they fluctuate quite a bit because people are in transit through Turkey onto Europe. The total when I was there was about 65,000 estimated, and now it's about 46,000 who remain in Turkey. But the UNHCR estimates about 145,000 refugees, so those who are registered as refugees from Ukraine. And the fluctuations are also due to the visa situation that's allowed for Ukrainians, in Turkey. They're allowed to enter the country like me as an American citizen and have a 90-day tourist visa if they choose. And so some have chosen not to apply for refugee status as a result. So I was looking at the mental health impacts across the migration trajectory and mainly pre-migration and during travel and transit. And the aim of my project was to highlight their mental health needs and to look at highlighting their mental health needs in order to improve mental health needs of refugee populations everywhere. So the rest of my presentation is a series of photos. Like I said, I was in Turkey in 2017. I will say the minute I arrived in Turkey, I could feel a tension in the air. The atmosphere was completely different with regards to welcoming refugees. And somebody told me, who I interviewed, that the situation facing refugees from Ukraine right now is a lot like the first 6 months of the Syrian crisis, where people had, sort of welcomed them with open arms. They were really looking forward to helping them. But now, as the situation seems, ongoing in Ukraine, that welcome will quickly fade. And when I spoke to Syrians who are still in Turkey as well, nearly a decade after the conflict began, it's very clear now that refugees are no longer welcome. And with upcoming elections in June of 2023 next year, migration is a key topic, and pushback against migration is something a lot of politicians are running on. I started my research in Istanbul. That's where I was based, just to scope out where Ukrainian families were being resettled or where they were settling themselves. And it soon became clear to me that I had to leave Istanbul and go to the Mediterranean coast, which happens to be where Eastern Europeans generally love to travel during the summer. So lots of Russians and Ukrainians typically go to Turkey, the Mediterranean coast, cities like Antalya and Alanya to visit and spend their summers. I made my way there. I was able to also enjoy the coast, which was really wonderful. And what's amazing about the market there was that there were all these signs in Ukrainian and Russian, and I truly felt like I was in an Eastern European city or port. And soon I met some Ukrainians who were doing some diaspora organizing and collecting donations for refugee populations and attempting to do their best to help them integrate and provide services. The highlight of my trip was meeting this couple who unfortunately were on vacation in Alanya when they tried to go back to Crimea, which is where they're from. They were unable to board their flight because it was February 25th, actually, so the day after the invasion, and they've been in Turkey ever since. They feel quite uncertain about their life and what's going to happen next. It was quite disheartening to talk to them about their mental health needs, which are largely unmet. They don't have access to health insurance as tourists in Turkey, and they are not sure if they will apply for refugee status, given that they're just hoping to go home in the coming months. They served me some Ukrainian borscht soup, which was amazing. Of course, it has to be served with vodka. It was one of the highlights of my trip was spending time with them. I also visited an orphanage that's led by Tatiana, who's a Ukrainian fashion designer who came to Turkey with her kids by car in March of 2022. She founded Childhood Without War, which is basically a resort turned into a summer camp for kids who are orphaned or are vulnerable and have been evacuated from Ukraine. I was able to speak to this teenager here, Anthony, who answered questions about what it's like to live in Turkey, and for the most part he was enjoying it but wanted to go home as soon as possible. Basically, what it felt like while I was there was that it was a summer camp. I think the one concerning thing is that the children eventually need to go back to school, and now it's well past September, so they have not been able to access formal education for more than 6 months now. But what the organizers do is try to make them feel as welcome as possible and give them activities to distract them with and to improve their overall well-being. But generally, the situation is quite precarious, and there's no funding that will sustain these organizations unless they receive funding or support from the government. I ended my trip by visiting a couple of NGOs that were working on refugee and migrant integration in Turkey. And the goal was just to learn what kind of services Turkey has offered refugees for the last decade. Essentially, Turkey has a lot of lessons learned that can be applied to other migrant populations coming in. And this is a group of theater students who are Syrian who complained to me of the general situation that was facing them now, feeling like they don't have a future in Turkey. So I have to say I felt quite pessimistic leaving Turkey. I think the situation for refugees is not great, and I don't think it will extend past this year. So it's something to keep a close eye on, and something that extends to Ukrainians as well, because for the most part, most of them want to go back home once the Russian invasion is over and the war is over. But what I'm seeing and what I anticipate is that Turkey is going to have to learn how to integrate these refugees for the long term. So I think that's that.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, I'm Laiba.
And I'm Wasay, and we are both journalism students in Northwestern University in Qatar.
Over the summers, we were in Pakistan reporting on the impact of COVID on female survivors of acid attack violence.
Yeah. Pakistan has built a reputation for being one of the deadliest countries when it comes to acid attacks. On an average, there are about 200 attacks in the country per year, and those are just numbers that have been reported.
80% of the victims of acid attack violence in Pakistan are females, which makes this a form of gender-based violence. In a lot of cases, the perpetrators are either their husbands or other family members.
Revenge-based acid attacks, they're not to kill, they're to disfigure. So the reasons why some of the women are targeted are things like not bringing in enough dowry for their in-laws, rejecting marriage proposals, and giving birth to daughters, not sons. So it's a societal problem. It's a problem that has something to do with the way people think.
Through our project, we wanted to capture their struggles as well as the social, legislative, and medical work that's being done to rehabilitate them back into society.
Especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, because the real focus of our project is how to rehabilitate survivors of acid attacks during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are there to document their quest to live an ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances.
Although there has been extensive media coverage of acid attack violence in Pakistan, which is why a lot of you may have heard about it, the coverage has almost always focused on the crime itself and follows like a victimization narrative.
What our project wants to do different is, our goal is not to show these people as victims, but to tell their stories which may inspire others about how they survived and how they're fighting day to day just to continue with their lives and make the best out of it.
So we decided to choose this topic because we wanted to focus on their empowerment journey. How did these women rebuild their lives following this horrendous crime? What resources and institutions were there to help them fit back into a society that was not willing to accept them?
So let's talk about our sources. So our first source is Noreen Jabbar. Noreen lives in Lahore with her 3 daughters and operates a beauty salon from her house. In her free time, she likes to cook and stitch clothes.
You'll get a sneak peek into Noreen later on in our presentation. 7 years ago, Noreen was attacked on the streets by her ex-husband while she was on her way to drop her daughters off to college. She sustained injuries to her face mainly, resulting in the permanent loss of one eye. But she was able to put her perpetrator into jail, where he's serving a 10-year life sentence currently.
Our next source is Humaira, who works as a cleaning lady in a hospital in Lahore.
Humaira was attacked by her in-laws during a domestic dispute between her husband and her in-laws, in which case they took their aggression out on her. Unlike Noreen, she did not pursue a judicial process because she was scared for the safety of her children. Instead, her and her husband, they just moved out. In a society where micro-mobility is a privilege that even women from better economic lifestyles cannot afford, Humaira drives an auto rickshaw. Do you guys know what that is? Okay.
Our next source is Rahila. Although acid attacks are more common in lower income classes, they are not a class issue, but a gender issue, and that's what Rahila tells us. When we met with her, she was only 16 when she was attacked with acid by a boy in her neighborhood after her family had refused the marriage proposal.
Okay. During our journey, we also met a couple of other women who were helping these women rehabilitate back into society. Justice Nasira Iqbal is one of the first female high court judges in Lahore. And she helped us understand the legislative and the judicial processes and the obstacles that survivors of acid attack violence face in Pakistan. Musarrat Misbah, she's an entrepreneur and the founder of Smile Again Foundation, which helps these survivors rehabilitate back into society by paying for their medical and cosmetic surgeries, as well as employing them within her business.
The next 2 sources are very different. So we have Mufti Taseenullah. We traveled all the way to the capital in Islamabad to meet with him. He is a representative of the religious center in Islamabad, the Red Mosque. So we took his opinion, his religious opinion on the issue, and we met with Dr. Mozintar, who's a veteran plastic surgeon who has spent years doing reconstructive surgery and setting up burn centers in Pakistan.
So some of the challenges, okay, well, the main challenge that we faced was in drawing a line between accurately portraying their stories, but at the same time making sure that we're not exploiting their trauma. That was like our main struggle. And
the struggle on the production side was that oftentimes these people lived in very small spaces, so setting up the tripod, setting up three-point lighting, that can be difficult at times in small spaces. So that was a struggle. And choosing which story to tell in post-production. Because we don't go in here telling our survivors what to say. We ask them to share their stories, and they share their stories, and based off of that, when we have so much information which we have to cut down and really get to the gist of our topic, that's hard. We have something prepared for you guys, and we hope you like it. It is a glimpse into our work.
hopefully it'll work.
एक आँख में शुरू मुझे मुश्किल पड़ी क्योंकि मुझे इस साइड से नज़र नहीं आता, तो मैं अचानक से जब उठती थी तो मेरी टकरें भी हुई हैं दीवारों के साथ, बहुत मसले पड़े हैं, लेकिन अब आदत हो गई है क्योंकि अब मुझे पता चल गया है, तो अब मैं अपने काम आराम से कर लेती हूँ। सिलाई मैं करती हूँ, अब थोड़ी नज़र मुझे वीक लगती है कि मेरी वीक हो गई है क्योंकि नज़दीक का मुझे नज़र नहीं आता, तो अब मैंने चेकअप करवाना है, तो फिर ज़ाहिर सी बात है अब लगेगा चश्मा, तो वो भी पहनूँगी, लेकिन काम मेरा हो जाता है, मैं कर लेती हूँ काम। कोविड में जाहिर सी बात है हर इंसान परेशान था उस टाइम, तो पोलैंड में तो वैसे ही कोई नहीं जाते थे, तो मेरा भी काम में फ़र्क पड़ा था, बहुत ज़्यादा काम नहीं आता था उस वक्त से काम अभी तक थोड़ा कम हुआ है, उस वक्त तो बहुत ही कम था, अब ये है कि अल्लाह का शुक्र है थोड़ा बहुत आता है तो मैं करती हूँ।
When I met Noreen, she was in a very bad shape. She needed operations also. She had actually lost half of her face. So there's a skin which has to be put just because there's nothing that one can do to, not even a prosthetic eye would help her. So Noreen is one of the bravest girl that I've come across.
14 साल की सज़ा हुई, तो 14 साल बाद अब ये 7 साल हो गए हैं उन्हें, 7 साल बाद अब जब बाहर आएंगे तो हमारे अंदर एक खौफ है, जो एक डर है कि पता नहीं अब आने के बाद क्या करेंगे। अभी तो फ़िलहाल सुकून है, लेकिन ये फ़ोन आता है बच्चों के पास कि मुझे माफ़ कर दो, मुझे बाहर निकाल दो, मैं अब कुछ नहीं ऐसा करूँगा, मैं बदल गया हूँ, तो बच्चियाँ कहती हैं हमने आपको बाहर नहीं निकालना, माफ़ हम आपको कर चुके हैं, क्योंकि पहले ये धमकी दे चुके थे, किसी को कह चुके थे कि मैं इसके चेहरे पे एसिड फेंक दूँगा। वो इसलिए कि मेरे अब्बू ने कहा था कि हम इसकी कहीं और कर देंगे, तुमने छोड़ना है तुम छोड़ दो, उसने कहा मैं इसका फेंक दूँगा ताकि इसकी कहीं और भी ना हो।
Thank you so much. If you want to look at the struggles of the other survivors, wait for our documentary.
Sorry, what button did you push? Yeah, perhaps. I don't want it to show like that though. Serious. Okay, we're just that's perfect. Thank you. Hi, can you hear me? Okay. My name's Paola, and I'm a Master's of Public Health student here at GW. And my story is centered around the uptake of the HPV vaccine in Cameroon, and how well-meaning evidence-based public health interventions flop when they aren't rooted in the understanding of their target populations. So to begin with, cervical cancer is the second most common cancer in Cameroon and the leading cause of death among women in Cameroon, or cancer death among women in Cameroon. prevalence varies wildly from study to study, which was a challenging aspect of the story. But about 1,500 women die annually are diagnosed annually, and 1,000 die annually. Those numbers might not seem large, but that it's a mortality to incidence ratio of 65%, which is an alarming number, and the reason I was interested in this story initially. So the thing about cervical cancer is that unlike many other cancers, it is a vaccine-preventable disease because it has an infectious origin, the human papillomavirus. So these women are dying unnecessarily. There are currently 3 effective and safe vaccines against HPV, the catch being that they must be administered in younger children before any sexual activity, and thus exposure to HPV occurs. In November of 2020, Cameroon, in the midst of the global pandemic, Cameroon introduced Gardasil, one of the vaccines, into the expanded program on immunizations. Having the HPV vaccine in the EPI was a huge victory for public health officials, a way to ensure high coverage of the vaccine and high uptake. Cameroonians didn't see it this way. As you can see, these headlines in French highlight how controversial this introduction were, especially among Catholics. For context, 70% of Cameroon is at least nominally Christian, and 32.5% of that subpopulation is Catholic. So within weeks of the vaccine's introduction, a prominent bishop sent a letter out to his congregants warning them against vaccinating their children. He wasn't the only religious leader to do so. And in a highly religious and communal society, the opposition from local leaders had a devastating effect on the vaccine's uptake in the population. So I spoke with Dr. Shalom Chokfe, who's the head of the EPI for Cameroon, and he said for prevalence of the vaccine currently, we're at 25% for the first dose and less than 10% for the second dose. And for context, in contrast, the US is at more than 71.5% in coverage right now. So the gap is huge. So why were people so reticent to vaccinate their children? As several doctors I spoke to said, the pandemic was fertile ground for people to talk about vaccines as a Western tool to control African populations. And the HPV vaccine rollout fell right in the middle of this discourse. Anti-COVID and vaccination sentiments in 2020 were strong, fueled in part by a French doctor going on a talk show and suggesting that vaccines be trialed in Africa. So when I spoke to people, what I heard the most was that it was unsafe, it was an experimental COVID vaccine, and that they didn't trust the things that the West handed out for free. Another important reason for people's opposition of the vaccine is its link to sex and reproductivity. In a society where premarital sex is taboo and reproductivity is of high importance, parents and the church were immediately wary of a vaccine whose target population is girls aged 9 through 11. The Catholic Church said that it encouraged promiscuity, and parents believed that the vaccine would sterilize their girls, which made them fear it. Much of this misinformation and opposition could have been avoided if authorities had taken the time to understand and educate their populations. As Dr. Chokfe told me, in Cameroon, people have more trust in their local leaders, so their pastors, their priests, and the heads of villages than the government. But public health officials did not take sufficient time to explain the vaccine to these leaders on a level they understood. And so, unsatisfied, these turned and warned their populations off the vaccine. I must once again stress that the influence and power of the Catholic Church has, because it's really different from here. The Catholic Church not only has social influence, but it also has a lot of health centers. For example, in the far north region, a third of people get their health care from Catholic centers, which because of their position on the vaccine, do not offer the vaccine. So that alone is a highly detrimental to vaccination efforts. So not only were community leaders not properly engaged, but there's also a lack of general awareness and understanding of cervical cancer, its risk factors, and prevention methods in the population in general. Of the people I spoke to, most did not know how it developed, what its risk factors were, and their doctors had never recommended it to them for their children. Many didn't know the answers, but plenty had questions of their own, such as, why only target young girls, and why is it for free? One doctor I spoke to expressed this frustration. Gone are the days where you can just parachute in interventions from the West and expect populations to blindly adhere to them. These measures need to be explained in a way that people understand and accept. So it's urgent that the Ministry of Health prioritizes health communication, awareness, and education around cervical cancer in Cameroon, because in the meantime, women continue to suffer and die, and they do so facing deep amounts of shame and loss of dignity. These are a couple of quotes I grabbed from various sources, putting personal context to a larger issue. So these are just some of the points that various public health officials cited to me. The Ministry of Health needs to put more funding into cervical cancer awareness and prevention. The response needs to be nationally coordinated. It needs to re-engage communities on this topic and give a platform to cervical cancer patients and survivors to share their stories. So these are some of my reporting challenges. Very new journalist, I've never done it before, but the thing that cropped up the most is people's reticence to be photographed. And I spent weeks with some people, and it's their prerogative, and I respected that, but I went in hoping to have a photo essay, and I got some, but most people were against it. And then again, the inconsistent data was really hard. And then just in general, people are typically reluctant to speak badly of a government's response, even when they see an issue. So, thank you.
Hello, I'm Maddie, and my reporting project focus was on female genital cutting in Guinea and how the movement to end it failed. So just to give some brief background on what FGC is and how it manifested in Guinea, FGC stands for female genital cutting, which is also sometimes referred to as female circumcision or female genital mutilation, and it is essentially what it sounds like. It's a rite that occurs most often in parts of West Africa and East Africa, but also in some other parts of the world, wherein a girl becomes a woman via the cutting of her genitalia. And this cutting can have fatal health complications, including hemorrhaging, death during childbirth, the transmission of HIV, and several other complications. This is not only because the cutting itself is quite harmful, but also because it's usually performed with a ceremonial knife that's been used for generations in the cuttings, and therefore it's not sterilized or anything. In addition, in the vast majority of cases, the cutting removes a woman's ability to ever experience any kind of sexual pleasure, and it is considered a violation of human rights according to the UN and the World Health Organization. And in Guinea specifically, it has the second highest rate of FGC in the world, after Somalia at 97%, and it's been practiced for over 2,000 years. And something interesting is surveys in Guinea show that Guineans believe FGC is required for religious reasons, and this is the case really irregardless of religion, whether that they're Muslim or Christian, which are the most common, or indigenous religion. They believe that FGC is required by either the Bible or the Quran. And in Guinea, something else that's very interesting is, despite the fact that many people believe it's rooted in religion, local religious groups are actually the main force combating it, especially interreligious groups, so Muslim and Christian groups working together to try to fight it, discussing it at sermons, etc. So that was my goal, was to go and explore that. However, my findings are a little complicated and would take, I think, over the 7 minutes. So I've decided for this to just focus on 2 interviews that I had with 2 women that I think had really interesting stories. They're really amazing people, and I just wanted to share their stories with the time that I had. So the first woman that I'll talk about is named Nar Kone. Nar knew that she had been cut, but she did not remember the cutting. This is actually pretty abnormal in Guinea, as women are usually, girls are usually between 9 and 12 when they are cut. And so this is very different, that she had no memory of the event. And so she was in college, she was at a medical biology course, and they were talking about female anatomy, and she realized that her genitalia did not match what she was seeing. So she went to the doctor, where she was told that her labia had been sewn shut. This does happen in some parts of the world. It's pretty uncommon in Guinea, though. And this did explain her really painful periods, her constant infections, and other health complications. But interestingly, when I was talking to Nar, that was really not what upset her. What she was really focused on was the fact that no one had ever told her this had happened to her. Of course, no one had asked her permission, and she felt very lied to and very cheated. And when she talked to her parents, they said that they will never give her the money to afford the surgery. And her mother told her to keep herself sewn shut until marriage. And so she vehemently disagrees, and she told me that when she has the money, she's going to get the surgery. And for reference, the corrective surgery costs around $500 to $600 US. And since then, Nara's actually taken her combination of her background in medical biology and her anger and frustration at what happened to her to become a feminist and activist in Guinea, not only in women's rights, but specifically about combating FGC. So she travels to women's markets and other places to speak to women and try to convince them, using her background in medical knowledge, not to let the procedure happen to their daughters. And one of the other women I talked to is named Aissatou Diallo, and she told me that when she was 11 years old, her mother's friend came to her and said, "Oh, do you want to go to this birthday party?" And then took her into the forest region of Guinea, where she was held down and she was cut. Her mother was furious. This was without her mother's consent. And so after she was married, she discovered that she was physically incapable of having sex. So she went to the gynecologist with her husband, and where she underwent a surgery to fix that. However, she told me that sex is so painful for her that she sobs every time. And so for her, this is really the crux of the issue. She said, "I have never felt pleasure with my husband. I would do anything to be able to feel pleasure while having sex with my husband. I have lost something great." And so for her, rather than her lack of consent, her lack of knowledge, she really, really was very, very angry about the lack of sexual pleasure that's been denied to her due to something that she wasn't in control over. And so this is her. She actually founded a school where she teaches young girls reading, writing, as well as more technical skills such as sewing, clothing. That's her with her students who range very greatly in age from women in their 20s to, I don't know if you can see, there's like a baby behind the sewing machine. And so the reason that I wanted to share these profiles of these two women is not only due to the time constraint, but also because I think it really highlights the fact that and this is the case with many of the women I talked to, they all had issues with FGC for a really variety of reasons. So for example, Nara was really focused on women's rights and consent. Aissatou was really focused on sexual pleasure. Some of the other women that I talked to cared a lot about health, childbirth. And the issue is really multifaceted, and that was really the crux of the failure in Guinea, which I don't have full time to talk about, but essentially the religious groups were really, really focused exclusively on health concerns, and this is the case in much of the world in combating FGC, and so part of the reason that the efforts have not been successful. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Right. Oh, yes, sorry. Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dylan Ortiz, and I'm a recent graduate of Westchester Community College. I now go to Fordham University. And the title of my project is Tackling Food Insecurity in New Orleans. So this past July, I spent 2 weeks in New Orleans, where I was reporting on the food insecurity crisis that is currently consuming the city. And before I talk about food insecurity, I want to distinguish its definition from the definition of hunger. So hunger is a physical sensation that you get when not eating food, but food insecurity is more of a lack of a consistent access to healthy, nutritious food, and also lacking the financial means to get this food. So according to the USDA Economic Research Service, from 2018 to 2020, the state of Louisiana had the second highest prevalence of household food insecurity in the country. And also Louisiana has one of the highest rates of food insecurity among children, with 1 in 5 children experiencing food insecurity. And also Orleans Parish in Louisiana has one of the highest rates of food insecurity, which is where New Orleans is located. So as a result, I decided to reach out to 2 nonprofit organizations that are working on addressing the issue of food insecurity at this time. So a little bit of background. The reason why I chose New Orleans was because I'm a big New Orleans Saints fan. And I actually won playoff tickets to see them in 2019. So I spent like 24 hours there. I didn't really get to experience the entire city in that amount of time. But I wanted to definitely go back. But this time, you know, return with a purpose and bring awareness to something that I feel very passionate about, which is food insecurity. So fast forward 3 years later, and the opportunity with the Pulitzer Fellowship arrived, and I was able to go and write an article, write field notes, and create a documentary about this issue. So the first organization that I was able to speak to was Culture Aid NOLA, and I was able to meet 3 incredible individuals who are in charge of running this organization. The first one being Erica Chomsky Adelson, the founder and executive director of Culture Aid NOLA. And she spoke to me about basically the origins of Culture Aid NOLA. So in March of 2020, when like restaurants were starting to close, they were able to rescue a lot of food from these restaurants and start to distribute them to the community. And in their first week, they were able to distribute 500 meals. And then their second week, 750 meals, and then in their third week, 5,000 meals. And then from there, they began to start the organization. And this is one of my favorite quotes out of the many quotes that she gave me during our interview. She said, "By bringing fresh, good food into New Orleans neighborhoods, Culture Aid is able to provide that sense of food safety where families know where their next meal is coming from and are more likely to cook together and eat things that they enjoy." The second person I was able to speak to is Ellie Duff, the operations manager at Culture Aid NOLA. And she spoke to me about basically the no barrier approach that Culture Aid prides themselves on, which is basically this idea that you don't have to show any sort of information to basically prove how poor you are, which at other traditional food pantries, you have to show you like a recent pay stub, things like that, to basically essentially prove how poor you are. At Culture Aid NOLA, you can show up in your car or just walk and arrive in a line, and you just get food. You pick up your food and you go. So she talks about the no barrier approach that Culture Aid has. And then I also spoke to Scott Kaiser, the logistics manager at Culture Aid NOLA, and he basically told me that this was his first time volunteering at all. And he just told me that basically just putting food in the hands of someone for the first time was an experience that he'll never forget, and he wants to continue that for as much as he wants to continue working with Culture Aid. And then the second organization I spoke to was lower9.org, which specifically they mostly work on rebuilding houses after Hurricane Katrina. But during the pandemic, they were also able to open up to work on food insecurity, and they opened a brick and mortar where they give out food to the community weekly as well. So I spoke to the executive director of lower9.org, Laura Paul, and she basically just told me how, before you have a roof over your head and a plate of food in front of you, you just can't do anything else. It feels like so many people are subsisting at that very basic level of human survival. I'd really like to see people get lifted up higher than that so that everyone can be successful in lots of other ways. So that's what she had to say about that. And then I also spoke to the volunteer coordinator, Sasha Dries, who also runs the food pantry. And she told me about her experience being food insecure and basically how, you know, it's not only like the parents or the head of household that is dealing with food insecurity, but it's also the children who see their parents struggling and, you know, seeing that they might not be able to get certain food certain times. So she said that when people are food insecure, it affects their physical health, but also I think it has a really big toll on people's mental health as well, obviously on the parent or head of household, but even the children in that house, I really think, suffer mentally when their family is food insecure because it brings stress onto them as well. And then I have a quick clip. I won't show all of it, but it basically talks about July Supply, which was the big event that I was able to film during my time there. And basically, it's one-of-a-kind event that needs to be replicated, where instead of giving out materials before a hurricane arrives, after a hurricane arrives, they're giving out materials before the hurricane arrives, so people are able to prepare before the hurricane touches down. So
At the very end of 2021, beginning of 2022, Erica Chomsky-Adelson and the rest of our operations team came together and were just brainstorming what we were going to do for hurricane season this year. We had an immediate and direct response after Hurricane Ida in 2021, which was a huge impact for the city, and we were able to help feed thousands of individuals every single day. So while starting to plan for our 2022 hurricane plan, we had the idea that we should do a large-scale distribution of hurricane supplies before a hurricane hits. The city of New Orleans, while we do have plans to evacuate, we don't always have the time to evacuate because tropical storms can turn into a Category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane at the tip of a dime and be very scary. So families don't have the opportunity to evacuate, nor do a lot of the families have the means to evacuate. At the very end of 2020,
So basically, she was talking about July Supply, and they were able to give out enough supplies to help 2,000 families prepare for hurricane season. And as of right now, I believe Culture Aid is also branching out and helping in Florida with the efforts of the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. And basically just these unconventional methods to help out the community, and that's really why I gravitated towards them. And they just wanted to stress the importance of using these unconventional means to address food insecurity. And my information's there, and please, if you feel free to look at my documentary on the Pulitzer website. So, thank you.
Great presentations, thank you. And fabulous to hear about Culture Aid making such a difference. Really great time. Okay, so we want to start with a Q&A, and if any of you have questions for each other, you can go ahead and ask them, and then hope that all of you here also have questions. So, does somebody want to get the ball rolling over here, or should we go to this group? Diana? And one thing, you need to share these microphones, and then I will give this microphone to any of you here who want to ask questions, because we are recording this, and so we want to get your questions in the recording. Okay, go ahead,
Okay,
Diana.
thank you. Great job, everyone. I wanted to ask Madeline a question, just due to the sensitivity of the topic that you were looking into. Two parts to this question. How did you sort of manage your own, well-being while doing these interviews? They're obviously very heavy. And then the second part is, how did you manage to access individuals who are willing to share such personal stories? And especially, it could be a very stigmatizing issue. So I'd be curious to hear about that, how you approach that.
Yeah, so the two questions are actually a little interrelated because the women that were the most willing to access and kind of talk about their experiences were usually the women that had, become activists and stuff, so they were a little more used to talking about their experience, so it was a little then easier on me as well because they were in a lot of a little more mentally okay with what had happened. it was hard to get access to people, and there are definitely a lot of people I hoped to talk to that I was not able to talk to. For example, I was trying really, really hard to be able to talk to one of the women that does a traditional cutting, and trying to see the other side of that, and women do that for a living, and I wasn't able to get access due to just my status as a reporter, and then in general, I was told that I hadn't gained a trust. I also clearly didn't a lot of it was because I was very clearly an outsider, and I think that made things a lot harder.
You're right here, but I was wondering about the acid attacks, because you said Noreen's perpetrator got charged, but how often are people sentenced and successfully charged for these acid attacks?
Wait. Yeah, you're right here. Yeah, that's a good question. So, do you recall that there were 3 women on the slide that Noreen was on as well? So Noreen's perpetrator did get charged, but more often than not, they're not charged. Humaira, the other girl that we interviewed, whose picture was right next to Noreen, the one who drives the auto rickshaw, she did not even pursue charges because she said that she feared for the safety of her children. But there are laws in place in Pakistan. So acid attack crimes, they were criminalized in 2014, which is kind of recent considering how long they've been going on for. But there's also a cultural kind of thing where a lot of people don't, they don't want to discuss their domestic disputes out in court, and they don't want to basically talk about things at home outside.
Yeah, just adding to that, one major thing was in Noreen's case in specific. So her husband got charged 14 years, 7 are already gone, so he's coming out another 7 years. So in the documentary, one of the questions that we asked her was, what are you going to do after those 7 years? And she said, I'm going to get my 3 daughters married as soon as I can, and then I'm going to sit there just waiting for him, waiting to see what he does. If he wants to, if he wants more revenge, then he's going to come for me. But I just want my daughters to be able to be as far away from him as possible. So that's a big legislative loophole when it comes to punishment. I don't think 14 years is nearly enough.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Go ahead. Oh, right.
Hi, my name is Nyla Barnes. Thank you all so much for breaking the ice and giving such phenomenal presentations. My question's for Paola. You mentioned that it was difficult to gain sort of permission to take photographs, and that impeded upon your ability to do the photo essay you planned on. How did you pivot from that, and what are you thinking of doing instead, or have you found a way to do the photos in a different way?
Yeah, so people did allow me to record them, record our interviews. So I have a bunch of recordings and might just do a pivot audio thing. But I started to try and get other kinds of ideas. So people let me take pictures of their hands a lot while they were talking to me. So I have a bunch of pictures of people while they're expressing themselves in some video clips that, yeah, that's where I'm at with that. But it was rather challenging. My father's a physician, and a lot of my connections are because of my father and other people I know. So I think that is an instance where that also might have impeded me a little because there was too much closeness or familiarity. So, yeah.
Thank you. My question is for Dylan. Dylan, you mentioned different aspects of food insecurity, both the proximity of food, the nutritional value of food, and the price point of food and how those interact. And I wondered, is there a clear explanation for what's the biggest challenge of food insecurity in New Orleans? Is it that food isn't, it's too expensive, or people live too far away, or it's not nutritious? Is there an aspect of food insecurity that's the biggest issue in New Orleans?
Yeah, so with lower9.org, they're based in the Lower Ninth Ward, which is one of like the departments of New Orleans. And basically, the issue, I think the biggest issue of food insecurity there is proximity to supermarkets. Because, for example, in the documentary Sasha from lower9.org, she talks about how the Lower Ninth Ward is basically divided. It's like, yeah, it's divided from the rest of the city by an industrial canal. And this canal, like, I crossed it, it takes like 15 minutes for it to open if like there's a boat that has to pass by, and it's this industrial canal is what's stopping people from going to New Orleans to get food, because in the Lower Ninth Ward, most of the food is getting like at corner stores or fast food restaurants. There isn't really like a supermarket there. It's kind of, I've read articles where it's just like the Lower Ninth Ward has one supermarket, and people have to leave their own like department in order to go get food. So I would say that proximity to nutritious food is probably the biggest factor in terms of food insecurity there.
Is this on? Yeah. Is it? Okay. Hi. I come from an IT background, so security is always on my mind. And the question is for all of you, if applicable. And I might want to extend this for the next 2 days as a question as well for all presenters. But while you're doing this research and basically boots on the ground, what steps do you take for either physical security and digital security while you're conducting this amazing work?
Thank you for your question, Ash. Well, I think having been trained in research and just having that at the forefront of my mind, of just maintaining ethical practices throughout the reporting is something that I did throughout by making sure that I prioritized the well-being and kind of the willingness of the individuals I was interviewing to disclose their identities or not. So any of the photos you saw where their faces were showing, that was because they elected to do so. And also I offered them the chance to change their names if needed, just because of the sensitivity of the conflict in Ukraine, how that was ongoing. Other than that, very astute and self-conscious about my own security and making sure that I'm not attracting too much attention. And while I see all of my colleagues like really amazing photos using like a digital camera, I use my iPhone. I wonder now if I had taken a digital camera, if that would have been to my advantage, because I think it might have made me stand out in a context like Turkey, where journalism is heavily monitored, and so it's just about, I think, balancing some of those issues. But I defer to my colleagues for more complicated situations.
Yeah, for us, it was both a physical threat that was present and a digital threat. Physical because we needed to make sure that the sources, their cases were not ongoing, so there was no present current threat to them. The perpetrators were either in jail or in another city, and they didn't know that this was going on, because that would have been difficult. Another thing was that when we were handling, because we'd gotten equipment from Northwestern, and that was very high-grade, expensive equipment, and we loaned it out, so we needed to make sure that nothing happens to that equipment. So a tip that a professor gave me was a very good tip. It said that take your equipment in old ragged bags so it looks like you're not carrying anything of particular significance. For digital security, I think mostly what I made sure of was that our footage or poster, everything was copyrighted. So that's all. Laiba, you can add more to this.
In terms of digital security, we also made sure we took written consent from all our sources to make sure that there won't be problems with that later on.
For me, my main concerns were actually both physical and medical. So I had a lot of things I had to figure out before I went. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and in addition, that with the electricity where I was going is extremely erratic, and so I had to deal with a lot of, how am I going to transport my insulin? Where am I going to keep it? This also affected where I stayed. It affected the amount of money that I spent while I was while I was there. And so that was something that I had to do a lot of research for, and actually like somewhat impeded me getting permission from my university to go. I eventually did, but I had a lot of plans of, what do I do if I got COVID, my only option was to leave and to get basically airlifted out of the country. And so I had to think of all my game plans of what happens if I get sick, where do I go, because where I was going, the medical care was extremely poor, and I wouldn't even have been able to trust any insulin I would have gotten there. So there was some physical stuff as well, but that was a big thing that I had to think a lot about.
I also, in terms of physical security, I think that the idea of like the bag in order to like not show the type of equipment that you're using is smart, because like for me at least, walking around New Orleans with a 30-pound tripod, I was bringing attention to myself. And I was made aware by both organizations, both executive directors from both organizations, that there was a prevalence of carjackings that's probably still happening right now in New Orleans. And I believe New Orleans right now is the murder capital of the country. And I was told that it was the second murder capital of North America a couple years ago. And there were, murders near where I was at the time that I was there. So I guess the way that I was just making sure that I was safe was just taking Ubers. I was told to just take Ubers rather than public transportation or walking. There was one instance where I did walk to the location where I was going to conduct an interview, and it was like a couple of miles because the Uber was pretty expensive. And it was on the main road, and I don't know if it's just me from being from like New York and just spending a lot of time in New York City that I just am able to just walk by, and if I see things I can just keep going and not really think anything of it. But I was told when I arrived that I shouldn't have walked that entire road. Like things are constantly happening there, carjackings and things like that. So that was definitely like a big learning experience that I should have been a little bit more careful, and I definitely was, because I was like at the beginning of my 2 weeks there, and then after that I was much more aware and just being more conscious with the way I was concealing my equipment and things like that. So.
Thank you all for the great presentations. I had a question for Paola on Cameroon, and you mentioned that the Catholic health centers were not administering the vaccine, and I hope you can say a bit more about why, what was driving that, and was there pushback either within Cameroon, in the Catholic Church, or elsewhere in the Catholic Church against that policy?
Yes. So again, it goes back to I think the influence the Catholic Church has, but like I said, when the HPV vaccine was introduced into the EPI, like, institutionally, the Catholic Church made like an institutional public opposition, like a letter to it. And so then, just like in a lot of, I used to live in Michigan, and some of our religious institutions don't offer like reproductive services. I think that is the same thing where, because they are faith-based religious private institutions, they can institute whatever policies they want in their centers, and they chose not to offer the vaccine because, again, of fears of promiscuity. They really stressed screening and not screening and vaccine, but vaccination is key in preventing the need for, like, screening isn't always 100% effective. So that is why, and pushback-wise, there's actually a lot of progress being made in Cameroon, because it used to, the Protestant church also was against the HPV vaccine when it first came out, but public health officials have been able to get them on board, and we have a pretty big Islamic community, and so everyone I talk to has told me that the pandemic, though that was an inflammatory moment, the necessity for better public health communication that COVID brought on, they do see it changing, and they do foresee that if they put enough manpower and fund resources into it, that they can get the Catholic Church on board.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Madeline, I have a question for you as well. So when you were interviewing these FGM survivors, like what vision of accountability did they articulate? Like how did they want accountability? You mentioned some became activists, some, wanted to get the surgery, but how did they articulate wanting to hold the people, I guess, who did this to them accountable, if at all?
That's a really interesting question, and I think especially because FGC is actually illegal in Guinea. It's not prosecuted, though, on any level, and additionally, it's in not all cases, but in most cases, it's the people's mother who calls the woman that does the cutting. She comes to the house. The woman also hides so that the kids don't see her because the girls will typically try to run away. And so it's not in all cases, but in most cases, it's a mother or a family member that makes that happen. And so people very rarely express a desire for those people to be in jail. They really focused on wanting to eradicate it, and what I heard time and time again was that they thought that people in power should be doing more to fight against it, such as especially religious actors, because I heard a lot that religion was the driving force in most people's lives, and they really wanted to just have it stop happening without any kind of they didn't really want a sense of retribution because it was so often happening from their own family.